The Last Soul by James Manning. He rarely spoke, not because he had nothing to say, but because the words seemed trapped beneath a weight in his chest. He wandered from place to place, dusty highways, neon-lit city streets, sleepy small-town roads, always watching, never engaging. Some part of him sensed that conversation would unravel him, reveal truths buried so deeply he feared their exhumation. And so, he remained silent. His constant companion was solitude. In every corner of the world, people drifted around him without a second glance, as if he were invisible. Perhaps he was. Time seemed to follow him like an obedient shadow, days folding into nights, nights blurring into days. He would step into roadside diners, slip onto bar stools at quiet cafes, and always order the same thing: black coffee. It was as though he were testing the world to see if anyone would notice him. But in a small diner off a forgotten road, someone did. Her name was Mabel, though he wouldn't learn this until much later. She was the waitress who served in the lonely corner booth by the window each evening. She had sandy blonde hair pinned back under a bright red headscarf, and her eyes were warm, the color of polished wood. "Evening, stranger," she said on his first visit, setting a chipped ceramic mug on the table. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the din of the overhead fluorescents. He only nodded, fixing his gaze somewhere just beyond her. Usually, people took the hint, turning away, but Mabel lingered. She glanced at his tattered coat, his worn boots, his unkempt hair. She saw him. "Long day?" She tried again. He said nothing, not a word. A small smile tugged at the corners of Mabel's mouth, equal parts compassion and curiosity. She set the coffee pot down carefully and slid the mug closer, then moved on to the next table. When she walked away, he felt the strange pang of her absence. He thought that would be it, but something, or maybe someone, kept drawing him back to that diner. Every day at sunset, he walked through the same door. Mabel would greet him with a gentle nod, fill his cup, and linger for a moment. She told him about her day, or the weather, or the new neighbor who moved in next door. He never responded, but he listened. More than that, he noticed the kindness in her voice. He absorbed every detail, every nuance, every reflection of light in her eyes, every shift of her expression. She treated him as though he mattered. She didn't ask too many questions. She simply accepted his silence as if it were a language of its own. There came a night quieter than usual. Only one other customer dozed in a corner booth. Mabel approached him, pot of coffee in hand. She didn't speak right away, just refilled his cup. But then her soft voice broke through the hush. "You know, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to. I just hope you're okay." For the first time, he almost answered her. The word yes hovered on his tongue. But fear of what he didn't fully understand sealed his lips. After a moment, Mabel gave a kind smile and moved away. And as she did, he felt a jarring sensation as though some cosmic gear had turned unexpectedly, the smallest click in the machinery of fate. That night, he stepped back out onto the moonlit highway. He had walked only a short distance when a man appeared on the side of the road. Tall, lean, wearing a dark suit that looked at once old-fashioned and timeless. His face was unreadable, pale, and his eyes were like blackened embers, swirling with a flicker of knowing. "You've gotten comfortable," the man said, his tone devoid of judgment, but heavy with significance. He stood still, studying the stranger. There was something in the air around them, an unsettling chill that made the hair on his arms stand. He said nothing, because he never did. "You don't remember, do you?" asked the stranger. He almost seemed sad as he took a step closer, his polished shoes stirring the roadside dust. "You were never supposed to stop," he continued, a voice resonating with quiet power. "Your role was fixed. You are death, the Grim Reaper, the end of all roads. Call it what you will. You've always known beneath your silence that you are different." The silent wanderer closed his eyes. He didn't want to listen, but the truth trickled through him like a half-forgotten memory. Splintered images, centuries of final moments, glimpses of silhouettes in candlelit rooms, gasping breaths, and parted souls, flashed in a swirling darkness behind his eyelids. A cold finality settled into his bones. "You chose to stop," said the stranger, his voice gentle but inexorable. "You found something compelling in mortal lives. Curiosity, maybe, loneliness too, but your final task remains undone. You are trapped in a loop, repeating these days again and again, returning to the same diner, the same coffee, the same waitress. She is the last one you were meant to claim before you deserted your post." He felt his chest constrict. Mabel's face appeared in his mind's eye, her concern, her kindness, her patience. A dull ache, unfamiliar, twisted in his heart. "If you don't take her," the stranger said, "the universe cannot move on. Time can't fully progress. She is tethered to you, and you to her." In that instant, he realized why the days felt so repetitive, why he was always compelled to return. Everything had become a silent circle, a loop that offered neither escape nor resolution. And in this loop, Mabel was always there, her life on the precipice of something she didn't even know. A breeze caught the stranger's tie, rustling it like a silent pendulum. It's time to decide, reap her, as was destined, or remain in this eternal loop. You're the only one who can break it. The wanderer's breath came shallow and short. He'd never feared anything before. Fear was not for death. Yet now, apprehension and sorrow gripped him. To take her life, this single person who had reached out to him with genuine warmth felt like an unthinkable betrayal. But to remain forever trapped, forcing her to wander these repeated days, never reaching her own future, was equally cruel. He turned away from the man in the dark suit, set his eyes on the diner sign glowing faintly in the distance. The sign flickered in the night. The stranger spoke again. "You must choose soon. The loop can't hold forever. The cracks are beginning to show." He found himself back at the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly as he stepped inside. It was late, near closing, and Mabel was wiping down the counter. Her eyes lit up just a fraction when he entered. She set her cloth aside and poured him a fresh cup of coffee. He didn't take his usual seat. Instead, he stood at the counter, meeting her gaze with a levelness that startled them both. Silence stretched between them like a tightrope. "I've been worried about you," she said softly, resting her elbows on the other side of the counter. "You come in here every day, alone, and She paused, catching the look in his eyes. Something in them had changed. "You okay?" He struggled to speak, to tell her something, anything, but every word felt like a finality he wasn't ready for. Unbidden, he took her hand. It was warm, so achingly alive. She stiffened in surprise, but didn't pull away. "You're shaking," she whispered. He gently released her. In that one fleeting moment, an entire world of possibilities crashed over him. She could live out her days, see new horizons, have triumphs and heartbreaks, become someone else's memory instead of just his. Or she could pass quietly in this stagnant loop, never knowing she was even caught in it. A subtle dizziness washed over him. The door to the diner swung open again, though no wind stirred outside. The man in the dark suit stood there, impossibly still. his presence commanding attention that Mabel did not seem to notice. He was an observer from beyond, existing in a space only the Wanderer could perceive. His eyes asked a single question. Now? Time seemed to slow. Mabel looked at the silent Wanderer with concern. "Hey," she said, her voice gentle as if speaking to a wounded animal. "Whatever's going on, it'll be all right. You don't have to talk if it hurts. I just want you to know that you're welcome here. Always." Her words pressed against the cracks of his memories. The centuries of endings, the countless souls whose hands he'd held in the brink between this world and the next. Something within him eased, and at the same time, something else finally snapped into place. He reached out, gently touching her cheek. Mabel's eyes fluttered with curiosity, perhaps even fear. Yet she allowed the contact, certain there was no harm intended. In his touch, she felt a strange chill, like a winter wind. He understood that he was at the pivot of his entire existence, to be death again or remain a traveler on an endless path. In a single, fluid moment, he withdrew his hand. A sudden hush filled the diner, as though all the clocks paused at once, uncertain of the next step. Then, in a voice raspy and unused, he spoke. "Liv?" It was barely a whisper, but the force behind it vibrated through the air. The man in the dark suit frowned from the doorway. He knew what it meant. Death had relinquished its final claim. A crackling sensation swept over the diner, a quiet tremor rippling across the floors and walls, a cosmic seam tearing somewhere. Mabel blinked, confused, gripping the counter for balance. She glanced around, her expression mirroring a faint alarm that she couldn't place. Then, inexplicably, the feeling dissipated, as though it never was. She touched her forehead, trying to shake off the dizziness. When she looked up, the Wanderer was gone. Only the bell above the door swayed lightly, clanging with the final note of a departure. Outside, the horizon lightened as dawn approached. In her hand, she found a small slip of paper. No words, just a faint symbol that looked like a leaf with a droplet of ink. She had no memory of him placing it there. She stepped outside into the cooling night air, scanning the empty road. Nothing but the lonely hum of crickets and the far-off whir of traffic. Silence. He stood on the edge of the highway, a few miles away, watching the faint lights of the diner as it shrank behind him. The man in the dark suit appeared once more, stepping out of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. "You've broken the loop," the stranger said. His tone carried neither anger nor approval, yet his eyes flickered with an undercurrent of something older than time. "She will live now," he continued, pausing to let the gravity sink in, "but there is always a price." A deep rumble sounded in the distance, as though thunder had cracked across a cloudless sky. The Wanderer felt a sudden pressure pulsing in his chest, as if his very being were rebelling. "You know what you've done," the stranger said, his voice barely audible over the phantom thunder. "Every soul has a final moment, every thread a place where it must be cut. You've stolen fate's scissors and spared her." The Wanderer braced himself, silent as ever. Though he had defied his own design, he had done it willingly. If a price awaited, he would pay. "It would have been simpler if you'd just taken her," the stranger said, and for the first time, a note of sorrow threaded through his words. "But now, that thread must be balanced. You gave her your immortality, your infinity, and in return—" He lifted a hand toward the Wanderer, fingers curling inward like a beckoning claw. A terrible chill shot through the Wanderer's veins. In one wrenching moment, a memory tore through the Wanderer's mind. Thousands of final moments he had once calmly witnessed, each one now latching onto him like burning brands. He gasped. For the first time in his endless existence, he felt genuine, visceral pain. "You hold them all," the stranger explained, voice hushed, "but as a reaper, you were insulated from the burden. Now you must carry every life you took, feel every pang of sorrow, every tear that was shed. You wanted to live among mortals. So be it. You'll share their suffering, and worse, you'll know the guilt." A swirling wind kicked up along the roadside, stirring dust and leaves in a frantic dance. The wanderer bowed his head, clutching at his chest. The weight of countless griefs pressed down on him, an agony he could barely endure. Still, he did not regret sparing Mabel. "You are no longer death," the stranger intoned, "but neither are you free. Each footstep you take will remind you of what you were, and what you can never be again." The wanderer's breath came in ragged gasps as the wind died down, leaving an uneasy silence. Across the empty road, a new light glowed on the horizon, the first sliver of dawn. In the hush, the stranger dipped his head, an odd gesture of respect and pity intertwined. "Farewell," he said, though the sound of the word echoed as though spoken from a great distance. Then, with a sigh that might have been regret, the stranger vanished. When at last the wanderer looked up, the diner was only a faint glow behind him, the neon sign flickering like a dying star. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. Exhaustion weighed heavily on his limbs. Mortality pulsed within him, raw and overwhelming. He staggered forward, not just physically burdened, but emotionally shackled by the memories of lives he'd once ended with impassive calm. Yet, for all the torment, a flicker of warmth nestled in his chest. Mabel would live. She would open the diner at sunrise, go about her day, greet her regulars, and smile at the passing drifters, none of whom would suspect how close she'd come to an untimely end. She would breathe and laugh and cry, and her life would unspool in all the messy glory humans held so dear. She would remember him, if only as the quiet stranger who drank black coffee and never said a word, yet somehow made her believe in the gentle kindnesses that exist in the world. Maybe she would even set out a second coffee mug sometimes, as though unconsciously waiting for him to return. But he would not. Not unless he dared confront the agony that now dogged his steps, each soul he had reaped forming a scar across his once timeless heart. His new future lay on roads untrodden, in a life he had never truly lived.